The story follows Margaret, a devoted, widowed mother who is quietly pushed out of her children's lives, culminating in their decision to deliberately exclude her from their 30th wedding anniversary celebration. Instead of breaking down, Margaret investigates in silence, confronts the truth, and turns the situation around with courage, wisdom, and remarkable clarity. Before we dive into all of this, let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. Connecting with viewers across the world is a huge source of inspiration for us. I've always believed that the morning light in Hollow Creek held a kind of magic, soft, golden, and slow to rise over the sleepy rooftops of our little town. At 78, I woke before the sun, more out of habit than need. My joints creaked in quiet protest as I sat up in bed, the old oak floor beneath my feet cool and familiar. Some mornings, like today, even the act of walking to the bathroom felt like scaling a hill barefoot. My house on Willow Street was no longer the one George and I built together. Not really. The wallpaper in the living room had faded into a patchwork of sunstains and time. The porch steps groaned a little louder each spring, as if mourning their age. George used to say he'd fix them next weekend. He never did. The heart attack got him first. It's been 8 years now, and still, I talk to him each morning like he's just stepped outside to prune the roses. I'd tell him the weather, the latest from town. Sometimes I'd whisper, "You wouldn't believe how tall Jonah is now," or Thelma finally sent a card. Only 3 weeks late this time. It made me feel less alone. This was the home our children David and Susan grew up in. Their baby footsteps, their teenage shouts, their laughter, all still echoed faintly, if you knew where to listen. David used to bang the kitchen screen door so hard I swore it would fly off its hinges. Susan would sneak out her bedroom window, thinking we never noticed. We did. But we let it slide because love does that. It gives room. These days, Susan visits once a month. Always in a rush. Always watching her watch. David comes more often, but only when he needs something money, usually. A signature. Help with taxes. "I'll pay you back next week," he'd say with a smile. 15 years of next weeks and not a dollar returned. But Wednesdays were for Jonah. Jonah is David's boy, though you wouldn't know it by how different they are. Jonah visits because he wants to. No hidden agendas. No guilt-tripping. Just tea, blueberry muffins, and talk about his college life. He brings warmth into this house that no new wallpaper ever could. This morning, I was just setting the muffins on the cooling rack when I heard the gate swing shoot his signature clumsy lurch, as if he still hadn't figured out how to move all 6 feet of himself in one graceful motion. "Smells like Grandma's special," Jonah called from the doorway. "You know it," I said, wiping my hands on my apron. "Come in, sweetheart. They're just the right kind of warm." He stooped to hug me, and I had to tilt my head all the way back just to see his face. When did he grow so tall? "How's school?" I asked, as he sat down at the kitchen table, already helping himself to a muffin. "Still fighting with calculus," he said between bites. "But I got an A on my last paper. Professor Duval asked me to help with a research project." "I always knew you were sharp," I said, pouring him tea. "Your grandpa would be proud." Jonah went quiet for a moment, eyes drifting toward the apple tree outside the window. I knew what he was thinking. George had taught him to climb that tree when he was 7. David had yelled that it was dangerous. George had laughed and said, "A boy's gotta learn how to fall before he can stand." "Grandma," Jonah's voice pulled me back. "Have you picked out what you're wearing for Friday night yet?" He blinked. "Friday?" He paused, his fork midair, an awkward look spreading over his face. "The anniversary dinner. For Dad and Claire. 30 years. They've got a reservation at Riverstone Lodge." "I thought he told you." The words hit me like cold water. 30 years. A milestone. Of course they should celebrate. But why hadn't David said a word? "Oh, well, maybe he forgot to mention it. You know your Dottie's always last minute with things," I said, trying to keep my tone light. Jonah looked unsure. "Yeah, maybe." We shifted to safer topic: summer plans. A girl named Emily he met at the library. A philosophy class he hated but couldn't drop. I nodded and smiled and asked questions. But my mind kept circling that dinner. Why didn't David call? When Jonah left with a promise to visit again soon, I stood at the window long after he'd gone, watching the street in silence. Across the road, Mrs. Fletcher, same age as me, was playing with her grandkids. Laughter filled her yard like music. I used to have that. Once. Then the phone rang. It was David. "Hey, Mom," he said, sounding oddly formal. "Just wanted to check in." "Hi, sweetheart," I answered. "Everything okay?" Yeah. Just about Friday. Claire came down with something. Doctor says it's some kind of virus. So, we're going to have to cancel the dinner. Real shame. We were looking forward to it." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said softly. "Is she all right?" "She'll be fine. Just needs rest. Anyway, we'll reschedule soon." "Of course. Give her my best." "I will. Gotta run, Mom. Talk soon." He hung up before I could say another word. And just like that, the seed of doubt took root. The next morning, I woke with a tightness in my chest, not from pain, but from a feeling I hadn't felt in years. Suspicion. It clung to my ribs like a chill I couldn't shake. I tried to brush it off, tried to believe what David had said. Claire was sick. These things happen. Plans change. But something didn't sit right. I made a pot of tea and tried to distract myself by organizing old photo albums. I flipped through pages of birthdays, backyard barbecues, and Sunday picnics by the river. There was David at 5, grinning proudly with a missing front tooth. Susan on her new pink bicycle. George teaching them both to swim at Willow Lake. When had things changed? When had my children begun to drift so far away? That afternoon, I called Susan. "Hey, Mom," she said, sounding distracted. I could hear rustling in the background, probably at her flower shop. "Everything okay?" "I just wanted to check on Claire. David said she came down with something serious." There was a pause. "Claire?" she repeated. "No, I haven't heard anything about that. What happened?" I blinked. "You didn't know? David told me they canceled the anniversary dinner because she was sick." Another pause. "That's strange. I talked to him yesterday. He didn't mention anything about canceling dinner." There was a quiet shift in her tone. I could feel it, like a wall, slowly building brick by brick. "Well, Mom, I've got a lot going on at the shop this weekend," she added quickly. "But if you're worried, just call David." "I will," I said gently. "Thanks, Susan." The line went dead before I could ask anything else. I stared at the phone for a long time. That itch in the back of my mind wasn't going away, it was growing. Thursday morning, I decided to get out of the house. I didn't need groceries. Not really. But I needed air. I needed to move. To think. I walked slowly to the town's market district, past the bakery with the cinnamon rolls George loved, past the post office where I used to drop off birthday cards for the kids before they all switched to digital. At the produce section of the local market, I spotted someone I hadn't seen in years, Doris Simmons, who used to work with Susan back when her flower shop was just a stall in the open-air market. "Margaret Ellison, as I live and breathe," she called, pulling me into a warm hug. "How are you holding up these days?" "Not bad for 78. I smiled. "You still working with Susan?" "Of course. She's taking the evening off tomorrow, you know. Big family dinner, 30 years and all that. They're doing it at Riverstone, I heard. Susan's been talking about it for weeks." He blinked. "Tomorrow?" I repeated. "She's still going?" Doris laughed. "Of course. Big deal. Everyone's going, David, Claire, even the grandkids. Whole thing's been planned for a while." I forced a smile. "Well, that's lovely. I'm sure it'll be beautiful." Inside, my stomach dropped. They had lied. Not just David. Susan, too. Claire. The whole family. I wasn't invited, not forgotten. Not overlooked. Deliberately excluded. I didn't remember walking home, but I found myself on the porch, staring at the street, my hands trembling. I sat for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Why? Had I done something wrong? Had I said something that pushed them away? Then the phone rang. "Grandma?" Jonah's voice. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I think I left my blue notebook at your house. Did you happen to see it?" "I can look around." While I checked the living room, Jonah kept talking. "If you find it, could you give it to Dad tomorrow? He's picking me up for the dinner at Riverstone. I froze. Picking you up? I asked softly. For the dinner? There was silence. Long. Too long. Jonah. Sweetheart. Your dad told me the dinner was cancelled. He said Claire was sick. Another long pause. What? No. No, she's fine. I just saw her this morning. They're still having it. Grandma, Waithe told you it was cancelled? Yes. More silence. Oh my God, Jonah said finally. He lied to you. I sat down hard on the couch, the breath knocked out of me. Grandma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know I thought you were going. I thought you'd be there. It's okay, I lied. I must have misunderstood. You know how I get sometimes. No, Jonah said, his voice tight. Number, you're not the one who's confused. After we hung up, I sat alone in the silence of my house, looking at the framed photo of George above the fireplace. What would you do, George? I whispered, and I heard the answer in my heart. Don't let them rob you of your dignity, Margaret. You deserve better. That night, I pulled out the old file box from the hall closet, the one with the deed to the house, George's will, our insurance papers. David had mentioned many times that it would be wise for me to transfer the house into his name. Susan had suggested assisted living for my own safety. I always brushed them off, but now I understood. They weren't worried about my well-being. They were circling. Friday morning came overcast and heavy. The clouds hung low like a warning. I ignored the tea. I ignored breakfast. I simply stood at the window and stared at the street. Then I opened the closet and took out my navy dress, the one I hadn't worn since George's funeral. Still crisp. Still elegant. I held it up to my chest in the mirror. It still fit. By 5 o'clock, I was dressed. I pinned my pearl brooch George's gift on our 30th onto the collar and called for a taxi. The driver raised his eyebrows at the address. Riverstone? He asked. You sure, ma'am? That's a fancy one. I'm sure, I said. And I'm not your ma'am. I'm Margaret Ellison. He nodded and didn't ask again. As we drove through town, past familiar streets and changing storefronts, I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, not even sadness. Something sharper, stronger. Resolve. If you're still watching, comment one so I know you're still with me. The sun was dipping behind the hills as the taxi pulled into the circular drive of Riverstone Lodge. The building, with its wraparound porch and warm lanterns glowing in the early dusk, looked like a painting, every detail curated for comfort and class. I hadn't stepped foot inside since George's retirement party, back when life still made sense. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The doorman glanced at me politely but didn't move. I didn't expect him to. My dress, though clean and pressed, was out of fashion. My heels scuffed from years in the back of the closet. But I lifted my chin and walked past him anyway. Inside, the lobby was a hum of soft piano music, floral centerpieces, and clinking glasses. The hostess looked up from her podium. Good evening, she said. Do you have a reservation? No, I said, calm but clear. I believe the Ellison party is already here. She blinked. Of course. They're in the garden room. Let me... But before she could stop me, I turned and walked down the corridor myself. I knew where the garden room was. George and I had danced our last dance there. The double doors were slightly ajar. I could already hear the laughter, the kind of laughter that made you feel like the world outside didn't exist. I saw Jonah first, seated near the end of the long table, stiff and clearly uncomfortable. His eyes met mine, wide with surprise. I pushed the doors open. The room stilled. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Forks paused mid-air. Eyes turned to David, Claire, Susan, even the twins. Their faces froze in varying shades of pale. Jonah stood halfway up, as if to run to me, but stopped short when David shot him a look. Mother! David's voice was tight, like a violin string pulled too far. Good evening, I said, stepping fully into the room. I heard there was a family gathering. Thought I'd stop by. Claire rose quickly, smoothing her napkin. Oh, Margaret! We were going to call you. Claire got sick. She seems much better now, I said, letting my eyes scan the table. Champagne glasses? Steaming entrees? No empty chairs? I turned to the hostess, who had finally caught up. "Would you be able to bring a chair?" I asked. "It seems I wasn't expected." "Of course, ma'am," she replied and vanished like a whisper. Susan looked like she wanted to disappear into her wineglass. David looked furious, but he tried to mask it behind a tight smile. "Mom," he said through clenched teeth. "We thought you wouldn't be up for it. The noise, the walking. You've said the hip pain's been getting worse." "My hip is just fine," I said, sitting down as the hostess returned with a chair. "Especially for an occasion like this." No one spoke. I folded my napkin, took a sip of the water that Jonah had quickly passed to me. I could feel his pride burning in his cheeks. I smiled at him. He smiled back small, but sincere. Claire cleared her throat. "Margaret, we didn't mean for you to feel left out. It was meant to be small." "It looks lovely," I said, glancing down the table at the lavish floral arrangements, the embossed menus, the catered dessert cart already rolling in. "How long has this been planned?" She hesitated. I already knew the answer. "I just have one question," I said, setting down my glass. "When did I stop being part of this family?" No one answered. "I must have missed the memo," I continued, "that said I was now simply a relic in the attic polished up for Mother's Day and Christmas, but too fragile or inconvenient for real life." "Mother," please, David tried. "Number. Let me finish." I kept my voice low, steady. "I raised you. I cooked every meal, paid every bill, stayed up through every fever, every heartbreak. Your father and I built this family from nothing. And now, I sit at home, alone, while my own children plan events and lie to my face." I turned to Jonah. "You didn't know either, did you?" He shook his head. "I thought you were coming." "Of course you did," I whispered. Susan finally spoke. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Mom. It's just, things are complicated. You always make things so emotional." "I'm your mother," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "If I feel, it's because I love. Don't you dare reduce that to inconvenience." Silence. The kind that hums loud in your ears. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small white envelope, slid it down the table toward David. "What's this?" he asked, not touching it. "The closing papers," I said. "For the house on Willow Street. It's been sold." Claire gasped. "You what?" "You told me once it would be wise to transfer the deed. Said it'd save trouble later. But I realized something this week. I'm not the one causing trouble. I just stopped pretending I didn't see what was happening." David's hands curled into fists. "You had no right." "I had every right," I snapped. "It was my home. Not an inheritance you get to plan around me." I turned to the rest of the table. "The money is being donated," I said, "to build a new reading wing at Hollow Creek Public Library. It'll be called the George Ellison Wing, because he believed in learning and community, and because he never once made me feel small." David's face had gone crimson. Claire looked like she was about to cry. "And, in case you're wondering," I added, "I've updated my will, my personal savings, the land in Pinebrook, and what's left from George's pension all going to Jonah. The only one who still knows what family means." The silence that followed was the kind you only hear after glass shatters. No one reached for dessert. No one dared to speak. Finally, Jonah stood up and walked around the table to place a hand gently on my shoulder. "Let's go home, Grandma." I nodded, and together we left the garden room. As the doors swung shut behind us, I heard the echo of silverware clinking against untouched plates. 3 days after the dinner at Riverstone, I woke before dawn, the kind of morning where the sky is still deep indigo, and the only sound is the ticking of the wall clock above the kitchen doorway. I made a pot of coffee strong, dark, the way George used to like it, and sat down at the table with a yellow legal pad. At the top, in neat, blocky letters, I wrote, "What still belongs to me." Underneath, I started listing not furniture, not heirlooms, not things that could be boxed and moved, but truths. My time, my voice, my freedom to say no, my right to stop explaining myself. I paused, tapping the pen against the rim of the mug, then added, "My name on the deed to Willow Street." It was easy to forget that part. In all those years of signing checks, co-signing loans, covering college applications, co-hosting birthdays, I had forgotten that this house wasn't just where I lived. It was mine. George and I had bought it together in 1967 with a VA loan and a folder full of big dreams. Now, it would become something else entirely. That afternoon, I met Helen Price, my lawyer, at her small but tidy office above the town bakery. She was in her 60s, sharp as a tack, and had a way of speaking that made you feel like everything was already taken care of, even if it wasn't yet. "The buyers are solid," she said, sliding the documents across the desk. "Young couple from Charlotte. He's a school teacher, she's a nurse. Looking for a place to raise a family." I looked down at the contract, ran my fingers along the familiar address. 18 Willow Street. "I raised a family there," I said softly. "Doesn't mean they stayed." Helen looked up, kind but firm. "You're not selling the memories, Margaret. Just the walls. The rest you take with you." I signed. It was done. A week later, I began the slow process of packing. I didn't need a moving crew. I didn't have much left I wanted to bring. The oak hutch in the dining room? Too bulky. The leather recliner? Jonah claimed it reminded him of Grandpa George, so I let him take it. The rest donated. I moved into a small but sunlit apartment on Maplewood Avenue, just a 10-minute walk from the library and the river path. It had 2 bedrooms, a tiny balcony, and a breakfast nook that overlooked a row of cherry trees. For the first time in decades, I bought new towels. I arranged my dishes in neat stacks and hung my wedding photo above the kitchen sink, not because I was trying to live in the past, but because I wanted to bring with me the parts that mattered. On my first night in the apartment, I lit a candle and sat on the floor, barefoot, sipping tea. There was no television blaring, no clock ticking in the hallway, no phone calls demanding anything from me. Just stillness. Peaceful, unfamiliar, earned. Over the next few days, I adjusted. I found myself saying good morning to the lady who lived downstairs. Name was Betty, and she walked with a cane but carried a tote bag that said, "Books, tea, silence." We got along instantly. Jonah visited every Saturday morning. Sometimes he brought Emily, other times just a box of donuts and his easy smile. He never asked about the dinner. He didn't need to. The air between us was free of explanations. One Tuesday, as I walked past Hollow Creek Public Library, I saw the sign posted out front. "Coming soon. The George Ellison Wing. A gift of love and legacy." I stood there for a long time, hand on my chest, feeling the way the breeze swept my cardigan just slightly back. There was something about seeing George's name in public. Not on a gravestone, not in some obituary, but on something that would continue to grow, that would house stories, laughter, discovery. That night, Charles Whitaker called. He had gotten my number from Jonah. "Margaret," he said, voice slow and gravelly. "I just wanted to say, what you did at that dinner, that was something." I chuckled. "Something is one word for it." "I meant it kindly," he said. "You reminded a whole room of people what dignity looks like." There was a pause. "Would you like to join me for a walk one evening?" he asked. "I make a pretty decent thermos of cocoa." I looked at the phone, smiling softly. It had been years since someone asked me something without wanting anything in return. "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. Spring in Hollow Creek always came slowly, as if the flowers and the people here needed time to be sure they were ready before blooming. In those early April days, sunlight slipped through the trees like a shy hello, and I, too, began to step into my new life, gently and without haste. My apartment on Maplewood was small, but it was bright and filled with birdsong each morning. I hung white curtains, placed a few orchid pots on the windowsill, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like my home was something I had to maintain. It was a space I had chosen for myself. Betty Langford, the elderly woman who lived downstairs, the one with the books, tea, silence. Tote turned out to be a treasure. She was a widow, a retired literature teacher, and she laughed with a raspy chuckle like the sound of an old wooden drawer. We spent many Tuesday afternoons on the porch, sharing almond biscuits and stories no one really needed to know anymore. One afternoon, she asked, "Margaret, You know what the scariest thing about growing old is? I suppose, loneliness? She shook her head. Number. It's starting to believe that the most beautiful parts of your life are already over. I went quiet. A few days later, I happened to see a flyer at the library. Volunteer needed. Children's Story Hour. George Ellison Wing. I brought it home, placed it on the table, and stared at it for a long time. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. The following Saturday, I arrived at the library at 9 a.m. The red-haired clerk, her name was Lorna, looked surprised. And you are? I'm George Ellison's wife, I said. I heard you needed a storyteller. Lorna looked puzzled at first, and then her face lit up. What an honor, Mrs. Ellison. Yes, absolutely, we could really use your help. The new reading wing wasn't quite finished, but there was a little corner with rugs, soft cushions, and low bookshelves for the kids. I settled into an old armchair, and in front of me sat 13 children, ages 3 to 7, one chewing on their fingers, another nudging their neighbor's foot under the rug. I chose The Snowy Dea. Simple, gentle story. I read slowly, with rhythm, giving each character a voice. As I paused to turn the page, I caught sight of their eyes. Wide, sparkling, captivated, and I realized my voice still had power. After the reading, a little girl named Lily tugged at my hand and asked, "Are you going to read again next week?" I looked at that messy-haired, chocolate-fingered child and felt my heart soften. "Next week," I said, "I'll tell the story of a cat that can fly." Word spread fast. The next week, 6 more children showed up. The week after that, nearly 30 parents, grandparents, even people who didn't know George at all, now packed into a tiny corner to listen to an old lady read aloud. I never expected it, but somehow, I'd become the storyteller of the town. One morning, Jonah stopped by while I was preparing a handmade storybook for the kids. "Grandma," he grinned, "Hollow Creek TikTok just called you the story lady." I nearly dropped my pen. "Tick what?" "I posted a video of you reading. It's got over 80,000 views. A school in Wisconsin wants to invite you to speak." I laughed, flustered. "They know I can't work a smartphone, right?" Jonah hugged me tight. "You don't need to be smart, Grandma. You just need to be yourself." On the official opening day of the George Ellison Wing, a light rain fell. Still, the crowd came. Some held umbrellas. Some wore thin plastic ponchos, but all of them stayed to the end as I stepped onto the small wooden stage. I stood before the audience with no speech, just a small photo of George in hand, the one where he's grinning in our garden, holding a worn copy of Mice and Men. "I'm not here to tell you about George Ellison," I said, "because he doesn't just belong to me anymore. He belongs to this library, to the children under this roof, to everyone who's ever felt forgotten." A soft breeze passed through. It took me years to understand this. No one can take your worth from you unless you hand it over. But if you hold on to kindness, to your voice, and keep forgiveness like a lantern in the fog, someday you stop searching for your place in the world, because you become the light. That night, I sat quietly at home, watching the street lamps cast long shadows across my curtain, and I felt fuller than I had at any ceremony in my life. Not because I was being honored, but because I knew I had stepped out of the dark, not through anger, not waiting for an apology, just by refusing to disappear from my own story ever again. If you're still watching, comment one so I know you're still with me. It was a Wednesday when I got the first letter. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through the mail like I always dyed electric bill, gardening catalog, and then that envelope. No return address. The paper was cream-colored and smooth, and the handwriting stopped me. Careful, hesitant, almost too neat, like someone trying very hard not to let their hand shake. I knew before I even opened it. It was from Susan. She started simply, "Mom, I'm not sure how to start this. I keep rewriting the first line. I guess I'll just say it plainly, I miss you. We all do. It's been quiet without you, and not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, the kind that echoes. I know I hurt you. I know we all did. I don't expect you to come back. I just wanted you to know. I see it now." I read it twice. Then I folded it slowly and slipped it into the drawer next to the teaspoons. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just sat there, listening to the stillness. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't relief. It was something else, like opening a window in a room you forgot had air. A week later, I was out on my balcony, planting marigolds, the kind George used to love. The phone rang inside. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something nudged me. It was Claire. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mom," she said. "I saw the video." I waited. "You were reading to the kids. They called you the story lady. I watched it 3 times. There was a beat of silence between us. I didn't know you had that in you." "I always did," I said, brushing the dirt from my hands. "You just never asked." She didn't argue. "I guess I never thought of you as someone who'd want more than the role you were given." "What role was that?" "You know. Mom, grandma, cook, helper, furniture," I said quietly. "That's what you mean. A fixture. Something always there. Until it isn't." She didn't deny it. Just breathed into the phone. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Are you?" "Yes. And I know it doesn't fix anything. But I'm trying." I joined the library committee. "We're working on a literacy project for single moms," Jonah said. "You inspired it." I didn't know what to say. Not because I didn't feel something, but because the feeling didn't come rushing in like a wave. It came slowly, like warm tea through cold hands. Familiar, but not bitter. Then, one Sunday morning, Jonah showed up with a padded envelope. "It's from the Pinebrook Arts Center," he said. "Someone nominated you for the Community Resilience Award." I laughed. "Me? For what, reading books and planting flowers?" "For surviving what would have broken most people," he said, so gently I almost looked away, "and then choosing to build instead of burn." The ceremony was held in the high school auditorium. Folding chairs, paper lanterns strung across the ceiling. No red carpet, but warm smiles. Kind faces. Teenagers who used to sit cross-legged on story-hour rugs. Retired teachers who remembered my name. Strangers who somehow felt like kin. When they called my name, I didn't bring a speech. I never needed one. I stepped up to the mic and said, "I once thought love meant giving everything, even when it cost you too much. I thought silence was strength. And I believed that if I just held on tighter, the people I loved would remember. But I've learned that sometimes love means letting go, not in anger, but in peace, so that everyone can learn to hold themselves." There wasn't a standing ovation, but the clapping, it lasted. Afterward, I stood in the hallway, sipping lemonade from a paper cup, when I saw her Susan. She stood near the exit, half in shadow, half in light. She didn't approach. She didn't smile. But she didn't leave either. Our eyes met. I nodded. She nodded back. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something. That night, Betty came up to the porch with 2 mugs of peppermint tea. "You look tired," she said. "I'm not tired," I told her. "Just full. The kind of full that doesn't need dessert." She chuckled. "You've become someone worth writing about." I looked out toward the moonlight on the sidewalk and said, "I didn't become. I just remembered who I was." That week, I wrote Susan back. Not a long letter. Just enough. "Susan, thank you for your letter. I hear you. And I hope that one day we can sit across from each other again, not as mother and daughter trying to fix the past, but as 2 women who are finally ready to tell the truth. Until then, Mom," I sealed it with wax. Not for flair, but because something sacred should feel cared for. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like the silence between us was a punishment. It felt like a promise. The invitation came in a cream-colored envelope, thicker than the ones I usually get. I knew Dan's handwriting the moment I saw it, clean, proper, slightly tilted to the right. He always wrote like he was being graded, even as a boy. Inside was a simple, handwritten letter, just 5 lines. No grand gestures, no overdone apologies. Just a request for dinner. Just the 2 of us. He said he had a lot he hadn't said, and that maybe it was time. I held that letter for the better part of an hour, carried it from room to room, set it down, picked it back up, made myself a cup of tea and let the sunlight pour over my hands, thinking how strange it was that something so small could weigh so much. I didn't respond that day, or the next, but 3 days later I wrote back. I told him dinner was fine, but I wouldn't be coming as a mother expecting to be consoled or corrected. I would be coming as a woman someone he needed to speak to honestly, if he was ready. It was a Thursday when I arrived at his house. Nothing much had changed. The navy shutters still framed the windows. Hydrangeas were blooming like they always did this time of year. And the porch light was already on, even though the sun hadn't quite set yet. He opened the door before I could knock, greeted me with a soft "Hi, Mom," and I returned the same. We stood there for a beat, both a little unsure of what came next. I stepped inside, took off my coat, and immediately noticed the smell rosemary, roasted chicken homie, careful, like he'd looked up what comfort might smell like. The table was set for two. Glass tumblers, cloth napkins, the kind of quiet effort that didn't need to be spoken aloud. We ate mostly in silence. Weather, work, light remarks about the hospital's new expansion. I listened, responded politely, took my time chewing, but when he cleared his throat, I set my fork down. I told him gently that if this dinner was meant to make me feel welcome, I appreciated the gesture, but I didn't come here to be comforted. I came for the truth. He paused, then admitted it that he had for far too long treated me like a given, like something stable, quiet, constant, non-negotiable. He said it probably started after his father died. I'd handled everything so efficiently, so silently, that it became easy for him to think I didn't hurt, or worse, that I didn't feel anything at all. And when they planned that anniversary party, the one where I was notably absent, he said Claire had asked if I should be invited, and he'd said no, because I'd complicate the mood, because I was too real, too close to the grief, too much a reminder of the parts of Dad they didn't want to confront. I listened, eyes closed, heart steady, and then I told him what he needed to hear, that his father was a better man than he'd ever given him credit for, and that I had never been an obstacle to anyone's happiness. I had been part of the very foundation of it. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. I told him he already had it. Because forgiveness, for me, wasn't about forgetting. I remembered everything. The ache of being left out. The sting of seeing photos I wasn't part of. Forgiveness, I told him, was simply the choice to stop carrying someone else's failure. I'd already set it down. Not for him, but for me. Then he pulled out a piece of paper, slid it across the table, said it was the paperwork to remove my name from our shared account, said he'd signed over Riverbend to me, said it had always been mine. I looked at the document, but I didn't touch it. What I needed wasn't property. It was understanding. I told him I wasn't a safety net, or an investor, or a supporting character in his life. I was a person, a whole one who'd given her life to this family and was only just learning how to give back to herself. He nodded and said he saw that now, but I told him seeing it wasn't enough. I didn't want apologies. I wanted boundaries, real ones, the kind that say, I won't be on standby. I won't be summoned out of guilt or convenience. If he wanted a relationship, it had to be honest, mutual. No more performances, no more surface-level calls. He asked if we could try again. I told him maybe, but not from where we left off, from where we really were. Before I left, he walked me to the door. The porch light was still on, the hydrangeas still swaying softly in the evening air. He hesitated before reaching for a hug, and I, just for a moment, stepped forward and gave him one. Not with warmth, but with clarity. I told him he could visit, but only if he called first, and only if he came not as someone seeking redemption, but simply as my son. He nodded, blinked a little faster than usual. I got into my car, started the engine, and sat there for a moment in the driveway. I wasn't angry. I wasn't relieved either, but I had said what I came to say. And sometimes that's the holiest thing a person can do, just show up, speak the truth, and leave without carrying what never should have been yours in the first place. It started with a question. Betty and I were sitting on the porch one afternoon, peppermint tea in hand. Sunlight caught in the edges of her silver hair when she said, almost absently, "Do you ever wonder how many stories we've never told?" "Margaret?" I paused. You mean the ones we forgot? No, she said, shaking her head gently. The ones we were never allowed to speak. That stayed with me. For days, I kept thinking about it. In the shower, while I watered the orchids, even while I shelved books at the library's children's corner. The idea of stories unspoken. Not because they were gone, but because they were buried. By shame, by duty, by the quiet erosion of years spent putting others first. So I asked Lornor red-haired librarian with a soft spot for Earl Grey and underdogs if the library had ever hosted programs for seniors. She blinked, thought for a moment, then said, Not really. A knitting group once, and a guy who taught bridge, but nothing that asked them to speak. Could we? I asked. Start something? She grinned. You mean like a story hour? For grown-ups? I nodded. Not just to listen, but to tell, to remember. We called it the room where voices return. Every Thursday afternoon, the George Ellison Reading Wing would close its doors to children and open them to anyone over 60 who wanted to sit, sip tea, and maybe if they felt brave enough, speak. The first week, it was just me, Betty, and a man named Carl who used to be a piano tuner before arthritis took his hands. He told us about the time he once tuned a piano backstage at Carnegie Hall and how no one clapped for him when he was done, but the silence afterward had felt like applause anyway. The next week, there were 5 of us. By the third, we had to borrow folding chairs from the back closet. There were stories of love and war, of secret poems never shared, of garden fences built and rebuilt by hands that now trembled. One woman, Hazel, brought a recipe book passed down from her grandmother and cried as she read the margin notes aloud. She wrote to me in sugar and smudged ink, she said. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought cookies. And every week, someone brought something they'd forgotten. They still carried a phrase, a memory, a moment that hadn't had a name in years. I didn't lead the group. Not exactly. I just asked questions. The right ones. The gentle ones. The kind that say, I see you. Take your time. One afternoon, Jonah surprised me by showing up and sitting in the back. Afterward, he hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. You don't just tell stories, he said. You make space for people to hear their own. I didn't have words for that. Just tears. The good kind. Then, something unexpected happened. A local journalista young woman named Megan, who used to attend Story Hour as a little girl, asked if she could sit in. She said her editor was looking for pieces about hidden changemakers. I told her I wasn't changing anything. She smiled. That's exactly why it matters. A week later, a piece came out in the Hollow Creek Gazette. The headline read, At 71, she's helping others rewrite the ending. There was a photo of me at the front of the reading room, holding someone's hand as they finished their first story aloud. My expression, surprised might, was steady, not soft, not grandmotherly, but strong. Present. A witness. That's what I'd become. A witness? Not to perfection, not to resolutions wrapped in bows, but to people finding their voice in the winter of their lives. Claire called the next day. I read it, she said quietly. I'm proud of you, Mom. I didn't answer right away. Not just because of the article, she added, but because you didn't wait for us to come around. You went ahead and built something without us. It wasn't out of pride, I said. I know, she replied. That's what makes it more powerful. There was a pause. Then she asked if she could come visit. Not with the kids, just her. She said she wanted to sit in, if I'd let her. Not as your daughter, she said. Just as a woman trying to remember who she is. I told her yes. That Thursday, she showed up 15 minutes early. Wore jeans and a cardigan I hadn't seen since college. She helped me set out the tea. She even asked Carl about his arthritis. When the group began, she sat in the back, hands in her lap. She didn't speak, but she listened like it mattered. And afterward, she hugged me longer than she ever had. I see you, Mom, she whispered. I held her close and replied, That's all I ever wanted. A week later, Betty handed me an envelope before the group began. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, Grant Proposal, Senior Storytelling Expansion Pilot. He blinked. I started. You didn't have to, she smiled. I submitted it to the State Literacy Board. Betty, there's funding available. We could take this to nearby towns, train facilitators, maybe even publish an anthology. My heart thudded, not from ambition, but from the simple, profound realization. Something I started with a single conversation had become something that might outlive me. That night, I sat on my porch again. No tea, no phone, just the sound of wind moving through the trees, like it was whispering all the things we've left unsaid. And I whispered back, not to anyone in particular, maybe just to the girl I used to be. You are not too late. You are right on time. And I believed it, because I could finally hear my own voice. And it didn't shake anymore. If you're still watching, comment 1 so I know you're still with me. It was Betty who first noticed the name. She had a clipboard in her lap, glasses perched at the end of her nose, scanning the list of registrants for our first outreach session in Maple Glen, the next town over. Margaret, she said, tapping the paper. Did you know there's an Emily Harper signed up for the workshop? The world tilted slightly. Emily Harper. My sister. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in more than 20 years. Not since the argument. Not since the funeral. Not since the silence became too wide to cross. I didn't answer Betty. I just stared at the paper and nodded slowly, like maybe the name belonged to someone else. But of course it didn't. Emily and I had grown up side by side, 2 girls in a house that smelled of lemon polish and quiet disappointments. She was always the more sensitive one, the peacemaker. And I was the one who did what had to be done. When our father died, I handled the estate, made the arrangements. And somewhere in the midst of grief, Emily and I had split wide open. It was about a letter our father had written before he passed. One I found but never showed her. Not because I wanted to hurt her, because I didn't know how to explain what he'd said about her, about me, about the things he regretted, and the truths he never spoke while he was alive. So I kept it. And when she found out, years later, it was too late for explanations. She said I had taken something sacred from her. That trust, once broken, couldn't be patched with good intentions. And that was the last thing she ever said to me. Until now.